Under the dim glow of the living room lights, I walked in, feeling more exposed than I should have in the simple black dress I wore. It wasn't anything overtly provocative, but the way it clung to my body made me self-conscious. My mother probably wouldn't have approved, but tonight, she wasn't here. It was just me and Thomas. I noticed the way his eyes flicked toward me, just for a moment, before he quickly turned his attention back to his phone. But that glance, it made my skin prickle and my heartbeat quicken. Something about the way he looked at me felt different tonight, more intense, more aware. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. "Hey," he said, his voice calm, familiar, yet carrying an undertone I couldn't quite place. "You okay?" "Yeah," I replied, forcing a casual smile. But inside, I felt anything but calm. The truth was, I wasn't okay. Not with the way he was looking at me, not with the way I was starting to notice things about him I'd never noticed before. The sharp lines of his jaw, the way his shirt stretched slightly over his chest, the warmth in his eyes that made my stomach flutter in a way it shouldn't. He was my stepfather. This was wrong. But the more I tried to convince myself of that, the harder it became to resist the growing tension between us. We sat down on the couch, and I could feel the space between us shrinking with every second. I kept telling myself to relax, to act normal, but the air felt thick, charged with something unspoken. I picked up the remote, scrolling mindlessly through the endless list of movies, hoping it would distract me from the way my heart was racing. "Anything you want to watch?" he asked, leaning slightly closer. His voice was calm, steady, but I noticed how his eyes lingered on me for a moment too long before he turned back to the screen. I shrugged, trying to act indifferent, though every fiber of my being was hyper-aware of how close he was. "You pick." He selected some action movie, something loud and mindless, but I barely paid attention to it. All I could focus on was the heat radiating from his body, the way our arms brushed slightly whenever either of us moved. Each accidental touch sent a jolt through me, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. About halfway through the movie, I felt his hand rest lightly on the couch, just inches from mine. I told myself it was nothing, that it didn't mean anything. But when his pinky finger brushed against mine, a shiver ran down my spine, and I knew this wasn't an accident. I should have pulled my hand away. I should have said something, anything, to break the tension. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed frozen, my heart pounding in my chest as his fingers slowly intertwined with mine. It was such a small gesture, so innocent on the surface, yet it carried a weight that left me breathless. We sat like that for what felt like an eternity, neither of us speaking, neither of us daring to move. The movie played on, forgotten, as the silence between us grew louder. Finally, he broke the spell, his voice soft, hesitant. "This probably isn't a good idea." I turned to look at him, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes I hadn't expected: uncertainty, vulnerability. It made my heart ache in a way I didn't understand. "Then why does it feel so right?" I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. The touch was so tender, so deliberate, that it sent a wave of warmth through me. I knew I should have stopped him, should have pulled away, but I couldn't. I didn't want to. Before I knew it, his hand was cupping my cheek, his thumb lightly tracing my skin. Our faces were so close now that I could feel his breath on my lips, warm and inviting. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest, but I didn't care. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Just as our lips were about to meet, the sound of a phone ringing shattered the moment. We both jumped back, the spell broken. He reached for his phone, glancing at the screen before answering. "It's your mom," he said, his voice tense. He stood up, walking toward the kitchen as he spoke quietly into the phone, leaving me alone on the couch with my racing thoughts. I tried to calm myself, tried to make sense of what had just happened. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was my stepfather, my mother's husband. And yet, it felt so right. When he came back, his expression was serious. "Your mom's stuck at the office. She won't be home tonight." My heart skipped a beat at his words. We were alone. All night. The tension in the room was palpable, and I knew that whatever line we had almost crossed moments ago was still there, waiting, tempting us to step over it. "It's late," I said, standing up, trying to break the tension. "I should probably head to bed." He nodded, but I noticed the way his eyes lingered on me, filled with something I couldn't quite name. "Good night, Ava." "Good night," I whispered, turning away and heading upstairs. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about him. About the way he had touched me, about the way his eyes had made me feel things I wasn't supposed to feel. Sleep didn't come easily that night. And as I drifted off, one thought echoed in my mind: this was only the beginning. "Oh, trust me, it's going to get much more complicated. You'll want to stick around, because things are about to take a turn no one saw coming." Over dinner, I couldn't shake the strange flutter in my stomach. The dining room, usually a place of casual conversation and laughter, felt suffocating tonight. Thomas sat across from me, but his presence seemed overwhelming. He wasn't acting like himself, his glances lingered too long, his smile too soft, his tone too careful, as if every word he spoke carried a hidden meaning. I kept my focus on the food, willing myself to act normal, to ignore the growing tension. But every time I glanced up, I caught him looking at me, his eyes dark with something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't the look of a stepfather. It was something more. And that terrified me as much as it thrilled me. "Everything okay?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Yeah," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess." He didn't respond, just nodded slightly, his gaze never leaving mine. The room felt too warm, the air too thick, as if we were the only two people in the world. After dinner, he suggested we watch a movie. I hesitated for a moment, knowing it was a bad idea. But something about the way he asked, the way his voice softened when he said, "Come on, it'll be nice," made it impossible to say no. We settled on the couch, and at first, I tried to keep a safe distance between us. But as the movie played on, I could feel him inching closer. His arm brushed against mine, sending a shiver through me. I shifted slightly, but it only seemed to encourage him. My heart raced as his hand found its way onto my thigh, resting there lightly, as if testing the waters. I should have stopped him. I knew I should have. But instead, I sat frozen, torn between the voice in my head screaming that this was wrong and the traitorous part of me that craved his touch. His hand was warm, his touch gentle, and I hated myself for wanting more. Just as the tension became unbearable, the doorbell rang, breaking the moment like a glass shattering on the floor. I jumped up, my heart pounding in my chest, grateful for the sudden interruption. Thomas sighed, running a hand through his hair before standing to answer the door. I could see the frustration in his posture, the way he hesitated before opening it. On the other side stood Jake, one of his old friends, grinning as if he had no idea he'd just walked in on something forbidden. "Hey, man," Jake said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything." His eyes flicked to me, then back to Thomas, and I saw the exact moment he noticed how tense the air was, how Thomas stood a little too close to me, how I looked a little too flustered. His grin widened, but there was a knowing gleam in his eyes. "No, of course not," Thomas said quickly, stepping aside to let Jake in. "We were just watching a movie." Jake's gaze landed on me again, his eyebrow raised slightly, as if he knew exactly what had been happening before he arrived. I could feel my face burning with embarrassment, the weight of the unspoken tension hanging heavy in the air. I needed to get out of there, to clear my head. "I'll, go get us some drinks," I muttered, escaping to the kitchen before either of them could say anything. Leaning against the counter, I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. My hands were trembling slightly, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image of Thomas's hand on my thigh, or the way it had made me feel. I didn't know what was happening between us, but one thing was clear: it wasn't going to fade away on its own. I had to make a choice. Either confront Thomas and set boundaries before things went too far, or pretend that nothing was happening and hope that this, whatever it was, would eventually disappear. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. This wasn't something I could just ignore. The line had already been blurred, and there was no erasing it now. And judging by the way Thomas had looked at me tonight, I had a sinking feeling that things were only going to get more complicated from here. I excused myself, heart pounding as I stepped out of the room, leaving Thomas and Jake behind. The hallway felt colder, quieter, a stark contrast to the heated tension that lingered in the living room. I leaned against the wall, inhaling deeply, trying to steady the chaotic rhythm of my thoughts. What was happening between us? How did things get to this point so quickly? Moments later, Thomas appeared, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held a seriousness that made my stomach twist. Without a word, he gestured for me to follow him upstairs. I hesitated for a split second, but the weight of the moment pulled me forward. I trailed after him, my mind racing with every step. Was this the talk we both knew was coming but were too afraid to initiate? As soon as we entered his bedroom, he closed the door behind us. The room felt too intimate, the dim lighting casting long shadows that only heightened the tension. We sat on the edge of his bed, the silence stretching between us like a fragile thread about to snap. "Ava," he began softly, reaching for my hand. This time, I didn't pull away. His touch was warm, grounding, yet it set off 1,000 tiny sparks beneath my skin. I can't deny it anymore. I've tried to ignore it, to push it aside, but I have feelings for you. And they're not the kind a stepfather should have. His words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. My breath hitched, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. His gaze searched mine, waiting for a response, but all I could do was sit there, frozen by the weight of what he had just admitted. "And," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper now, "from the way you responded earlier, I think you feel something too." I opened my mouth to deny it, to say something that would make all of this go away, but nothing came out. Because deep down, I knew he was right. I did feel something confusing, something dangerous, something I wasn't ready to admit to myself, let alone him. And yet, here we were, standing on the edge of a cliff, ready to plunge into the unknown. Without thinking, I leaned into his touch, drawn by a force I couldn't understand. His hand cupped my cheek, his thumb brushing lightly against my skin, and I found myself leaning in, our faces inching closer. Time seemed to slow, the world fading away until there was only us. But before our lips could meet, the sound of footsteps echoing up the stairs shattered the moment. We pulled apart quickly, hearts racing, as the door creaked open to reveal Jake standing there, holding 2 glasses of wine. "Thought you both could use these," he said casually, stepping into the room and handing us the glasses. But the knowing smirk on his face told me he wasn't as oblivious as he pretended to be. He knew something was going on, and that realization sent a wave of panic through me. "Thanks," I mumbled, taking the glass and using it as a distraction, my hands trembling slightly as I raised it to my lips. Thomas took his glass as well, his expression carefully neutral, though I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers gripped the glass a little too tightly. Jake leaned against the doorframe, casually sipping his wine as if he had all the time in the world. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, until he finally spoke again. "Didn't mean to interrupt anything," he said, his tone light, but there was an edge to it, a subtle hint that he knew exactly what he had walked in on. "You didn't," Thomas said quickly, his voice steady, but I could sense the underlying tension. "We were just talking." Jake raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced, but he didn't push the issue. "Well, don't mind me. Just thought I'd stop by and catch up. It's been a while, you know." Thomas nodded, though his grip on the glass didn't loosen. "Yeah. It's good to see you." I stayed silent, sipping my wine and avoiding Jake's gaze. The tension in the room was palpable, and I knew that things had just gotten a lot more complicated. Whatever was happening between Thomas and me wasn't as secret as we had hoped. Jake's presence was a reminder that we weren't alone, that our actions had consequences. After a few minutes of awkward small talk, Jake finally left, closing the door behind him. The moment he was gone, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "That was close," I whispered, setting my glass down on the nightstand. My hands were still trembling, and I clenched them into fists, trying to steady myself. Thomas set his glass down as well, turning to face me. "We need to be more careful," he said, his voice low but firm. "If Jake suspects anything." "I know," I cut in, not wanting to dwell on the consequences. "But what are we going to do, Thomas? Whatever this is, it's not just going to go away." For a moment, he didn't respond. He just looked at me, his expression conflicted, as if he was battling the same war inside himself that I was. Finally, he reached out, taking my hand in his once again. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "But what I do know is that I don't want to lose you. Not now, not ever." His words sent a shiver through me, and for the first time, I allowed myself to admit the truth. This wasn't something I could ignore. This was real, and it was only going to get more intense from here. And deep down, I knew that whatever happened next, our lives were never going to be the same. The next few days passed in a blur of stolen moments and suppressed desire. Thomas and I tried to act normal, to behave as if nothing had changed, but the truth hung heavily in the air between us, impossible to ignore. Every shared glance, every accidental touch, every fleeting smile only fueled the fire growing between us. We were walking a tightrope, knowing one wrong step could send us plummeting into chaos. At night, I lay awake in my bed, replaying every moment we had shared, every touch, every look. I didn't understand what was happening to me, this pull I felt toward him, the way my heart raced whenever he was near. It was dangerous, forbidden, yet it felt inevitable, as if we were being drawn together by something beyond our control. One evening, after my mother had gone to bed early, claiming she was exhausted from work, Thomas approached me in the hallway. His expression was serious, his eyes filled with that same unspoken tension that had been brewing between us for days. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly, his voice low and cautious. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I should have said no, that nothing good could come from being alone with him right now. But instead, I found myself nodding. "Okay." He led me to his study, a room I rarely entered. It was warm, cozy, filled with dark wooden furniture and the faint scent of old books. As soon as we stepped inside, he closed the door behind us, turning the lock with a soft click. The sound made my pulse quicken, and I felt a knot of anticipation form in my stomach. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Thomas stood a few feet away from me, his hands shoved into his pockets, as if trying to keep himself in check. But his eyes betrayed him, they were filled with longing, with something deeper, something raw and unspoken. "We can't keep going on like this," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's driving me crazy, Ava. I need to know if you feel the same way." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could I possibly explain what I was feeling when I didn't fully understand it myself? All I knew was that when he looked at me like that, with such intensity, it made it impossible to think, to breathe. Before I could say anything, he took a step closer, closing the distance between us. His hand reached up, gently cupping my cheek, and I leaned into his touch without thinking. My heart was racing, every nerve in my body on edge as he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a soft, tentative kiss. The moment his lips touched mine, it was like a spark igniting a fire. A jolt of electricity shot through me, and all the confusion, all the longing, all the tension that had been building for days poured into that kiss. I found myself kissing him back, my hands gripping his shirt as if I needed something to hold on to before I completely lost myself. For a few blissful moments, nothing else existed but the two of us. But then, just as quickly as it began, it ended. The sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway shattered the moment, pulling us back to reality. We broke apart, panic flashing in both of our eyes. Thomas moved away from me just as the door handle turned. The door creaked open, and there, standing in the doorway, was my mother. Her eyes widened in shock as she took in the scene before her and me, standing in the middle of the room, my face flushed, and Thomas, looking equally guilty. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice trembling with confusion and suspicion. I froze, my mind racing for an explanation, but I couldn't find the words. My mother's gaze flicked between the two of us, her expression hardening as realization began to dawn on her. The tension in the room was palpable, suffocating, as silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Thomas cleared his throat, stepping forward slightly. "Susan, it's not what it looks like." "Then what is it, Thomas?" she cut in sharply, her voice laced with disbelief. "Because it looks like you were just with my daughter." I wanted to say something, to explain, but what could I possibly say that would make this situation any better? The truth was, there was no good explanation, no excuse that could undo what she had just seen. Tears welled up in my mother's eyes as she stared at Thomas, then at me. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Both of you." She turned on her heel and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed through the house, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. I turned to Thomas, my heart sinking with the weight of what had just happened. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he ran a hand through his hair, looking as lost and uncertain as I felt. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "We'll figure it out. Together." But deep down, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. This was only the beginning of a storm that threatened to tear everything apart. And no matter how much we wanted to believe otherwise, there was no going back now. The secret we had tried so hard to keep was out, and we were about to face the fallout, whether we were ready for it or not. The room felt colder now, as if all warmth had been sucked out by the weight of my mother's fury. I stood frozen, watching her retreating figure disappear down the hall, the echo of the slammed door still ringing in my ears. My breath caught in my throat, and a wave of guilt crashed over me, heavy and suffocating. Thomas remained by my side, his hand gripping mine tightly, as though letting go would mean losing me forever. His face was pale, his eyes clouded with worry, but there was also a quiet determination in his expression that steadied me. "We have to fix this," he said quietly. "We can't leave things like this." I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure how we could possibly fix the mess we had created. Everything felt like it was unraveling too quickly, slipping beyond our control. Yet, despite the fear gnawing at me, I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't walk away from Thomas now, not after everything. Taking a deep breath, we walked toward my mother's bedroom. The door was shut, but light spilled out from beneath it, a sign that she was still awake. I hesitated for a moment, my hand poised over the door, before finally knocking softly. "Mom?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. There was a long pause before she answered. "Go away, Eva. I don't want to talk to either of you right now." "Please, Mom," I said, my voice pleading. "We need to explain." The door creaked open just a few inches, revealing my mother's tear-streaked face. Her eyes, once filled with warmth and love, now burned with anger and betrayal. She didn't say anything, just stepped aside, allowing us to enter. Thomas and I exchanged a brief glance before stepping into the room. The air inside was thick with tension, each breath feeling like a struggle. My mother sat down on the edge of her bed, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression hard. "Explain, then," she said coldly. "Explain how my husband and my daughter thought it was okay to betray me like this." Thomas took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. "Susan, I know how this looks, and I know it hurts. But it wasn't something we planned. It just happened. And I'm sorry, but I can't deny how I feel anymore." How you feel, my mother repeated incredulously, her voice rising. She's barely an adult, Thomas. You're supposed to be her father figure, not whatever this is. I know, Thomas said quietly. I know it's wrong, but I love her. I didn't mean for it to happen, but it did, and I can't change how I feel. My mother's gaze snapped to me, her eyes brimming with fresh tears. And you, Ava? Do you love him too? Her question caught me off guard, but there was no point in denying it now. I swallowed hard, my voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I do. For a moment, the room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of our confession pressing down on all of us. My mother's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of her as the reality of the situation sank in. I can't believe this, she said, her voice trembling. You too. I trusted you both. I know we've hurt you, Thomas said, stepping closer. And I'm so sorry for that. But we need to figure out a way to move forward, to handle this together. My mother shook her head, standing abruptly. There's no moving forward from this, Thomas. You've broken something that can't be fixed. She turned to me, her expression softening slightly but still filled with pain. Ava, you're my daughter. I love you, but this can't happen. It has to stop. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, we heard a loud knock at the front door. My mother frowned, clearly not expecting anyone. Who could that be at this hour? Thomas exchanged a wary glance with me before heading downstairs to answer the door. My mother and I followed closely behind, the tension in the air thickening with each step. When Thomas opened the door, we were met with 2 police officers standing on the porch, their expressions serious. Good evening, one of the officers said, his tone professional. We received a call from one of your neighbors about a possible domestic disturbance. Is everything all right here? My mother paled, glancing nervously at Thomas and me. There's no disturbance, she said quickly. Just a family disagreement. The officer's eyes flicked toward Thomas, then to me, his gaze lingering for a moment before he nodded. If you're sure. Just doing our job. We're sure, Thomas assured him. Sorry for the trouble. The officers nodded before turning to leave. As the door closed behind them, the tension in the room remained heavier than ever. My mother turned to Thomas and me, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and resignation. This isn't over, she said quietly. But for now, I need space. I can't deal with this tonight. Without another word, she turned and walked back upstairs, leaving Thomas and me standing alone in the hallway. I let out a shaky breath, the weight of everything crashing down on me. What now? I whispered, turning to Thomas. He reached out, taking my hand in his. We take it one step at a time, he said softly. No matter what happens, we'll face it together. I nodded, knowing that whatever came next, our lives had already changed forever. There was no going back now, only forward, into the unknown. And despite the fear and uncertainty, a part of me was ready to face it, because I wasn't alone. I had Thomas by my side, and together, we would face whatever storm lay ahead.